Astrology and Epistemology, excerpted from the book The Fundaments of Medical Astrology by Ciro Discepolo, Armenia Editore, Milan 2005. On the doctor's medical symbol, the caduceus, you can read medical art, not medical science. Personally, I believe that this does not debase medicine. In fact, it dignifies it. Let us consider the case of a measuring doctor. Once I had an ophthalmologist check me. In many ways, you could define him as a scientific doctor, 1,000 per mil. My problem was a sort of dryness on my eyes. He examined me with precision instruments, clocking certain times, consulting tables, and eventually he declared that my value of dry eyes was thus implying that I was fine. Later on, I had another doctor check my eyes. She was an ophthalmologist too, but a less scientific one. I did not mention my problem to her. She too examined my eyes with instruments, but above all, she asked me a sequel of questions about my life, my job, and my food habits. She almost seemed to be willing to analyze my whole persona, but she eventually concluded that my problem was dry eyes, and that it would be a good thing putting drops on it, as well as following certain therapeutic and prophylactic protocols specifically suited for this lesser pathology. Interesting, isn't it? Now you tell me, in your opinion, should a medical doctor be a scientist who perfectly knows how to use his instrumentation and knowing perfectly about everything that has ever been tested and discovered in a laboratory? Or don't you rather think that for your health, it would be better if a medical doctor behaves more like the Italian physician Antonio Cardarelli, who used to observe carefully, to interrogate cautiously, to speak very little, and eventually to formulate his diagnoses, which usually proved to be exact? In other words, would you trust better a doctor with portable computerized equipment or a doctor with good knowledge of psychology, sociology, literature? A doctor whose interest is to keep himself updated in the fields of agricultural policy, pollution, animal abuse? Who likes reading about the ancient research on water memory, about the discoveries that help validate astrology, and so on? The bottom line is, as a good friend of mine, an important professor of medicine at a university, a man with a fantastic classical culture and thousands of interests in virtually every field, claims, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the so-called scientist of our days is nothing more than a technician. So if you stick to the etymology of the word, the paradox could be exactly the following. Nowadays, a technician with a great passion for knowledge could embody better than a scientist the spirit of Plato's motto, "The unexamined life is not worth living." This quote from Martin Heidegger's Letter on Humanism explains the same notion. The atomic age could so captivate, bewitch, dazzle, and beguile man that calculative thinking may someday come to be accepted and practiced as the only way of thinking. Thus, we have reached the point where I wanted to lead my readers to the question of the radio repairer. I would like to delve into it a little, then come back to medicine, and eventually explain what spurred me to write this book on medical astrology, which you hopefully are just beginning to consult or study. You may know that I have stated several times that when dealing with astrology, I try to act as a radio repairer who knows that if he replaces a valve, the radio will play again, even if the owner of the radio set is a physicist who claims that this is not possible. Now, I believe that the most interesting example to delve into this notion is that of the flying bumblebee 2 that should not be able to fly. Let us put it in other words. In a nutshell, more or less the question is as follows. From the books on flight mechanics, every student of aeronautical engineering has learned that bumblebees cannot fly. In fact, their squat shape, their specific weight, excessive compared to the extension of their wings, and their overall physical structure are opposed to the possibility that they could ever take off and fly. But the bumblebee doesn't know it, hence it flies. Wonderful, isn't it? So, let us consider whether anybody has ever been able to expose these notions at a higher level of knowledge and culture in a broad sense. In my opinion, within the frame of the subject we are developing in these pages, science historian Alexandre Koyrès, From the World of Approximation to the Universe of Precision, is extremely interesting. 2. I present to you some passages with the clarification that in his book Koyrès, who's a giant of the philosophy of science, specifically deals with science and technology. Among other things, he wonders how come the science of ancient Greeks could remain, so to say, hibernated for several centuries before finding practical application that may be useful to man. Let me quote the passages more relevant to the notion of the radio repairer. In an essay published in this very place, I have claimed that one cannot find satisfactory solution to the problem of machinism considered under its double aspect. A. Why was machinism born in the 17th century? Why wasn't it born 20 centuries earlier, particularly in Greece? 3. This is a paradoxical enterprise. For reality, the reality of daily life, in which we live and stay, is not mathematics, nor is it possible to mathematize it, for it is the domain of the moving, of the imprecise, of the more or less, of the roughly. 4. That the technical thought of common sense does not depend on scientific thought, even if the former can absorb from the latter the elements that can be embedded in common sense, that it can develop, invent, adapt ancient discoveries to the new needs, as well as making new discoveries, that guided and stimulated by experience and action, by victories and blows, it can transform the rules of technique and can also create and develop both tools and machines. That with often rudimental means, thanks to the ability of those who use them, it can create works whose perfection, not to mention their beauty, highly exceed the products of scientific technology, particularly at its earlier stage. The history of Middle Age gives us striking evidence of all this. 5. Nonetheless, it is possible to wonder whether this apparent double deficiency could be explained exactly through the typical mentality and the general structure of the world of the more or less. Now, as regards to this, it seems to me that the case of alchemy gives us the definite answer. In fact, during his millenary existence, unique among the science of the earthly things, alchemy could build its own vocabulary, notation, and even equipment that our chemistry has received and preserved in inheritance. Alchemy gathered treasures of observation, performed thousands of experiments. It also made important discoveries. Yet it has never been able to make a specific experience. This is because it has never even tried to. The descriptions of alchemical operation have nothing in common with the formulas of our laboratories. They are cooking recipes, as imprecise, approximate, and qualitative as recipes. It is not the material impossibility of performing measurements that constrains the alchemist. He simply does not make use of them even though he has them at hand. It is not the thermometer that he lacks. It's the notion that heat could undergo an exact measurement, Thus he is content with the terms of common sense, high flame, low flame, etc., and he virtually never uses scales. Yet scales exist, and the scales of the goldsmith and jeweler are fairly precise. But this is exactly the reason why the alchemist does not use it. For if he used it, he would be a chemist. Better said, had he in mind the notion of using scales, he would already be a chemist. 6. But to tell the truth, Galileo didn't know much more than Vitelloni, yet it was enough to allow him to concretize his idea after contemplating it. Also, there is nothing simpler than a telescope, or at least a spyglass. To build them, there's no need of any science or special lenses, therefore not any specialized technique. 2 spectacle lenses put one after another. This is what a spyglass is. A note from the author. Roughly speaking, this is what a radio repairer does when replacing a valve in the radio receiver. As surprising and unlikely as it may be, for 4 centuries, it did not occur for anybody to see what would happen if they had used 2 pairs of spectacles at the same time, instead of simply one. It is a matter of fact that lens makers were no opticians. They were only craftsmen. They did not make an optical instrument. They made a tool. So they built it according to the traditional rules of their art, without looking for anything else. There is a deep truth in the, perhaps legendary, tradition, claiming that the invention of the first spyglass is due to chance, to a little son of a Dutch lens maker who was simply playing with lenses. 7. Nothing will reveal this fundamental difference better than Galileo building his telescope. While Lippershey and the Janssens, having discovered by mere chance that a specific combination of lenses builds up a spyglass, restricted themselves to making the unavoidable and somehow inevitable adjustments to their reinforced spectacles, a tube, a mobile eyepiece. When Galileo gets the news of the approaching spectacles from the Dutch, he comprehends their theory. Based on this theory, surely insufficient still a theory, Galileo carries each time farther the precision and the power of his lenses, thus building his series of perspicilli that gape at the immensity of the sky before his eyes. The Dutch glasses had never done anything like this before, exactly because they hadn't the same idea of the instrument that guided and inspired Galileo. So, the aimed and attained goal was completely different between them and Galileo. The Dutch lens is a practical device. It allows you see a faraway object at a shorter distance, overcoming the limitations of the naked eye. It does not go farther, and it does not even want to go farther. It is not by chance if neither its inventors nor its users ever used it to watch the sky. On the contrary, the radio repairer replaces the valve to have the radio receiver work. But after this initial stage of passive literacy of his own science, through practical experience, he progresses in his knowledge and creates a path of theoretical practical experiences that allow him to achieve, the necessary changes having been made, to Galileo's telescope. This leads us to a crucial point that forces us to a newer flashback of some thousands of years. As the historians of astrology teach us, 9, the first written testimonials of this discipline date back to about 2,800 years before Christ in Mesopotamia. There and then the astrologers, astronomers, priests advised their monarch to promulgate laws in order to compel his subjects to try to conceive in the month of July, so that many individuals be born in the sign Aries, because they were rightly considered to be the best fighters In those times, war was a very serious matter, requiring people to deal with it full time. This was based on the observation of the astrologers considering the features of those born in Aries. They did not ask for the approval of statistics or science. They simply noticed a matter of fact. It worked. Let us consider medicine once again. Often, but not always, medicine makes use of statistics. Sometimes the testing of certain drugs, whose aim is healing serious diseases, is carried over a few dozens of patients. If the doctors establish that the active principle works without evidently harming side effects for the patient, not even after a span of time, the drug is approved. Without the seal of science? No, without external seals. This line of reasoning, eventually you would say, leads to me in this book. Medical astrology has never been at the top of my thoughts, neither as an astrologer nor as a person. I was and am convinced that in this field, the best author should essentially be a medical doctor. Nevertheless, I could not avoid thinking that I had almost 36 years of experience, studies, and researches. Thus, I have been collecting an impressive, to me, amount of objective knowledge and data, a real fortune that would run the risk of being lost hadn't I resolved to write it all down on paper. Of course, I am aware that my knowledge in this field is only a tiny segment of an infinite line. Nonetheless, as you can directly notice by studying the life of your beloved ones, of yourselves, and of your acquaintances, in the light of the lesser and major fragments of truth that I am going to expose, many things can be affirmed much beyond a simple theoretical hypothesis. Perhaps statistics one day will validate certain items of my medical astrology. For example, my statistical work carried over thousands of seriously ill hepatic patients, which you can read at the end of this volume, has been limited by the lack of the exact time of birth in the studied sample. This may have spoiled, statistically speaking, the positive result that I yet achieved. Had I known also the time of birth of each patient, not only would I have searched for Jupiter in Sagittarius, I would have also considered the significantly strong elements in Sagittarius to our 9th house, or a ruling and blemished Jupiter, or the cusp of the 6th house in Sagittarius, and so on. But for the time being, I think I'm already able to claim certain bits of truth with enough tranquility and intellectual honesty. Dozens of cases examined and studied with the craving of a researcher, and with the support of my extraordinarily good memory, 10 have thrown at me pieces of evidence in such a clear way that only a blind person or someone in bad faith could not have been able to notice them in practice. Take, for example, the case of blindness and deafness. You will get convinced, not much with my examples, rather with your own examples, that the astral combinations that I have detected are, virtually in the totality of cases, those which actually indicate these pathologies. The converse, however, is not true. That is, in every chart in which such a combination exists, the disease does not manifest itself in the individual that it represents. This is why I agree with a good friend and colleague of mine, whom I value very much, who wrote about the difficulties facing the multifactoriality of a system of analysis. But such multifactoriality does not allow us to freeze and hibernate in thought and actions. We shall state that a certain illness or disease can be certainly detected clearly in the native's birth chart, even if there is one case over 1,000 that does not match that particular tenet, and even if we'll never be able to see a multitude of other pathologies in someone's birth sky, not to mention that many medical doctors also aren't able to see them. I would also add that the book you are reading is no substitute for your doctor at any stage of the possible pathological life of a human being. It is intended particularly for researchers, to my good colleague astrologers, and to beginners who are thirsty for knowledge. Of course, nothing would prevent you from putting into practice the teachings of this book. For example, should you notice a danger for the sight of a newly born baby, you could advise his parents to have it checked often by an ophthalmologist, while you should never suggest drugs or therapies. I would like to add that this volume has been greatly inspired by the wonderful essay of André Barbeau that you can read in the postface of this book, which by no chance takes the very same title as his essay. In my opinion, his essay is an essence of truth and includes very clever statements that I had never had the chance to read anywhere else. I think it is equally imperative for me to add that this text does not pretend to be exhaustive in the field. It deliberately limits itself to the only pathologies of which I have had a significant and direct experience. This means that I provide a maimed list of items, yet a list that everybody can verify, a list of items concerning specific pathologies. I prefer so rather than to expound a purely theoretical exercise, wishing to attain an alleged completeness, yet a work that would reveal to be totally unfulfilling and unable to describe the practical reality of our existence. I would have liked to add many more things, but this would open two long threads that may probably be worth individual and separate future elaboration. Before concluding, I feel bound to give my warm thanks to my friend Lorenzo Vancheri. With affection, yet without any trace of indulgence for any sort of typo, he helps improving the quality of my works with highly precious suggestions and remarks. Let me also express my gratitude to my friend Pino Valente. He is an important international artist, as well as an excellent computer expert. He has helped me tailoring this book, particularly enriching it with the drawings he has personally cast, using my software programs Astral and Aladino. The birth data are almost exclusively taken from my personal database or from Grazia Bordoni's data collection. Finally, in republishing this preface today, I would like to emphasize once again, referring back to the discussion of the telescope invented by Galileo Galilei and not by the son of a Dutch spectacle maker, that the universe that opened up downstream of my technique of aimed solar returns has nothing to do with the simple mathematical calculation used to draw graphs of solar returns. Ciro Discepolo, Naples, the 14th of March, 2005.